Morris police officers Cassie Price and Nick Pampanella are co-defendants in a federal lawsuit filed by relatives to 3 teenage children, although I think, they're all teenage still. One of them might be 18 now. Of Olivia Schwab, Pampanella killed the Morris woman in her apartment parking lot on September 29th after Officer Price did not deploy her taser. Well, he didn't. He killed her because she was advancing with a knife, right? So he's making his own independent self-defense decisions. By the way, to come back to the Casey Price body-worn camera video. So they're giving... They're giving verbal commands to Olivia Schwab.
Stop moving. Stop moving.
Drop the knife. Stay back. Stay where you are. Stop moving. What's the real purpose of verbal commands, folks? Is it to compel the person to obey your commands? No, it's not, because your words cannot compel them to change what they're doing. It may convince them to change what they're doing, but they make that call. So they're worth giving because who knows, maybe the person will comply, but that's not within your control. That's within their control, whether or not they comply. The real purpose of verbal commands is to present boundaries that person cannot cross without being subject to some escalated degree of defensive force. Stay back and they keep coming closer. That's an evidence-based perception of them acting in a manner consistent with ability, opportunity, jeopardy in particular, such that you're reasonably perceiving an imminent deadly force threat, and you can articulate the reasonableness of that perception in this evidence-based way. It's the same with this female cop. She's saying, whatever she's saying, stop moving. I mean, the purpose of that is if those commands are not obeyed, if that boundary is crossed, you do something. You take out your gun, you take out your taser, you take out a baton, you step behind, you do something. There's a boundary for a reason, so that if it's violated, that indicates to you it's now an appropriate time for you to do something that you otherwise might not want to do. Of course, the Nick Pampanella already had his gun out, so he'd already done the thing. He was ready to shoot to defend himself. Casey Price, it's almost like she's high. I mean, what's the point of anything she's doing or not doing? It's completely pointless. All right, back to the news story. The lawsuit filed Friday in Chicago's federal court, and I have that lawsuit. We'll take a look at it in just a moment. Names Officer Pampanella, Officer Casey Price, and the city of Morris as defendants. So this is what's called a 1983 case in federal court. This is routinely what happens when there's a use of force event by police and somebody wants to sue over it. Under federal statute, section 1983, you can go right into federal court. You don't have to deal with state court, and have a pretty good shot of getting some kind of settlement from the department, regardless of the merits of the case. Because like here, the city, so of course you always sue everybody, and this is a civil action, not a criminal action. The officers have already been criminally cleared. But this is a federal civil suit filed by the 3 surviving children of Olivia Schwab. And you always sue everybody in a civil suit, everybody you can attach, because, why not seize an opportunity where you may be able to get compensation for the harms that have been done to you believe. But really what happens in these police use of force cases is the target of the suit is not really the officers, although they're always named in the suit because they don't have any money. You can't squeeze blood from a stone. Right? You want a $20 million settlement. You're not getting it out of a street cop. He doesn't have $20 million. You're going to get it out of the governmental agency for which he works. In this case, the city of Morris. And of course, in the context of the city of Morris, whether they decide to settle is not a decision made by the police officers. It's a decision made by politicians who run the city. And the question is not so much, is there legal merit to the civil suit? The question is, are the politicians willing to spend other people's money, taxpayer money, to make their own political problems go away? And generally they are. So you have a pretty good shot of getting some kind of settlement in most of these cases, especially a case with emotional strings that can be plucked, like this one. So the whether or not the incompetence of Casey Price has any legal effect in terms of black letter law on the prospects for getting a settlement here. And frankly, I think It doesn't, as we'll see in a moment. It certainly has an emotional effect, right? Provides a narrative that the plaintiff's attorney here can share with the media, share with the public, describe to the politicians how he's going to make them look if they don't settle, to try to induce the politicians to agreeing to some kind of settlement, a third of which the plaintiff's lawyer walks away with as his compensation for bringing the suit, typically. Let's see. Well, I'm going to look at the actual suit itself in a moment. Morris police officer Nick Pampanella fires his gun at Olivia Schwab after she begins running at him, clutching a 9-inch long chef's knife in her left hand. So it's not that different than this Glock knife, folks. It's pretty big. Let's see. We're going to read the lawsuit filing, so I'm not going to read the quotes from it here. Officer Casey Price did not discharge or even unholster her taser as Olivia Schwab walked right past her. Yep, that's correct. 2 seconds later, defendant officer Pampanella shot Olivia Schwab 3 times, including a lethal shot to her face. That looks like the CNS hit that took her out. Let's see. She died instantly. In October, her family created a GoFundMe to cover her funeral expenses and to provide financial support for Schwab's 3 children, Nick, Nathan, and Stacy, who were all under the age of 18. They raised $13,000 towards a fundraising goal of $15,000. She loved her children very much and tried very hard to get better for them. They were her entire world. Her children are absolutely devastated with the loss of their mom. The GoFundMe noted, we're asking for support in helping her get the final resting services she deserves, in addition to financial support for the children, to seek different counselors that cater to their special needs to help get through this difficult time. I mean, it's a tragedy all around, right? It would be nice if we had effective mental health services in America. We just don't. We just don't. All right, so here's the actual federal lawsuit that was recently filed. By the way, all this stuff, of course, the videos, the lawsuit, and the Supreme Court case we're going to look at in just a moment, they're all embedded in the Law Self-Defense member blog post version of this post. So when the playback version goes up on the blog, you'll be able to access all this as if you're a Law Self-Defense member. So Nicholas Schwab, that's the oldest son, as son and independent administrator of the estate of Olivia Schwab, deceased, and also his 2 minor siblings, who are identified only by their initials here, are also plaintiffs. Versus Morris Police Officer Nicholas Pampanella, Morris Police Officer Casey Price, both individually and as employees of the city of Morris and the city of Morris itself. So this is an action for civil damages brought pursuant to the 4th and 14th Amendments to the United States and under Illinois state law. Federal claims herein are brought pursuant to Section 1983 for the deprivation of Olivia Schwab's constitutional rights, venue, jurisdiction. Olivia Schwab, deceased, was an individual who at all times relevant here too was living in the Northern District of Illinois. That's a jurisdiction issue. Well, it's a non-issue, but they're just making clear that jurisdiction is appropriate. Nicholas Schwab, as Olivia Schwab's eldest son, has petitioned to be independent administrator of her estate. Defendants, Morris police officers Nicholas Pampanella and Casey Price, were at all times duly appointed Morris police officers employed by the city of Morris, acting in the capacity of sworn law enforcement officials acting under color of law. Defendant, the city of Morris, was and is an Illinois municipal corporation, blah, 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 blah. So, factual summary. On September 29th, 2023, Olivia Schwab, by the way, so this factual summary, this is the representation of the facts from the perspective of the plaintiffs. They don't need to be true. They're not evidence. Claims in a filing are not evidence. They don't have to be making coherent legal arguments, as we'll see. So the legal arguments are made later, right? In the contentious negotiation or trial itself. But this is how the plaintiffs, the survivors of Olivia Schwab, want the facts to be presented to the court. So on September 29th, 2023, Olivia Schwab resided in an apartment complex. She had a history of mental illness. In September, Olivia Schwab was under the care of mental health professionals and was in the process of transitioning from her residential facility into her own apartment. I guess that was a little premature. On September 29th, Morris Police Department received a 911 call from counselors who worked with Olivia and were informed that she was suicidal and threatening to harm herself with a knife. So defendant officers Pampanella and Price were dispatched to her residence and knew she was suicidal and threatening to harm herself with a knife. By the way, should we have sent social workers to this call? Unarmed social workers? Would that have been better? As the defendant officers approached the parking lot in front of Olivia's apartment, Officer Pampanella told Officer Price to go non-lethal, referring to the use of non-lethal force. Of course, Price did nothing in response. As the defendant officers entered the parking lot of the complex, Olivia Schwab was in the doorway of her first-floor apartment, still on her cell phone, speaking with one of her counselors, with her cell phone in her right hand up to her right ear, and she held a knife pointed to the ground in her left hand. See, she was holding it, folks, like this. They're going to characterize that as pointing it to the ground to suggest that it was not being held in an offensive way. Like maybe she'd just been preparing dinner in the kitchen. Of course, we saw it different. The knife pointed downward in her, let's see. As Olivia exited her apartment in the parking lot of the complex, she continued to hold her cell phone up to her right ear and held the knife pointed downward in her left hand in a non-threatening manner. Was that a non-threatening manner? Now, maybe if she had kept her position in the doorway, it might have been non-threatening. Can you possibly interpret it of non-threatening when she's advancing on the officer while he's shouting at her at gunpoint to stop advancing on him? Could it possibly be non-threatening when she starts rushing at him? Of course not. Defendant Officer Price took a position on the sidewalk of the apartment complex, and Pampanella remained in the parking lot. Schwab slowly walked out of her apartment. Pampanella yelled to Price to tase Olivia Schwab with her department-issued taser. Price did not discharge or even unholster her taser as Schwab walked past her. 2 seconds later, Pampanella shot Olivia 3 times, including a lethal shot to the face. When Pampanella shot and killed Schwab, she still had her cell phone up to her right ear and held a knife in the downward position, never raising it or threatening either defendant officer in any way. That's a bit of a stretch, counselor. After Pampanella fatally shot Schwab, the officers handcuffed her in the parking lot of her apartment complex. Schwab's counselor was still talking on the cell phone that fell from Olivia's hand after defendant Pampanella shot her in the face. Is that legally relevant that the counselor was still talking on the phone? Is that legally relevant to this use of force event by the officers? Of course not. Is it intended to evoke sympathy for Olivia Schwab? Of course it is. And here we have the claims. The acts of defendant officers Pampanella were deliberate and malicious deprivation of Olivia Schwab's constitutional rights against excessive force, as granted by the 4th Amendment of the Constitution and made applicable to the states by the 14th Amendment. That seems like nonsense. He was clearly justified in using deadly defensive force in this scenario. This is a little more difficult. Defendant Officer Price also had an opportunity to intervene to prevent the use of excessive force by Pampanella and failed to do so. Now, there is a legal doctrine called the legal doctrine to intervene, where if one officer sees another officer using unlawful force on a suspect, the observing officer has a legal duty to intervene to prevent that use of unlawful force. Does that apply here? Was Pampanella's use of force unlawful? Of course, in the claim, they're going to characterize it as that for 2 reasons. One is they want Pampanella's use of force to be unlawful, so they have a claim against Pampanella and a claim against the city of Morris. But they also need it to be unlawful because that's the only legal foundation they have for going after Officer Price. Because normally Officer Price would not have a legal duty to intervene. Believe it or not. Unless Pampanella's use of force was unlawful and she was observing this, then she could have a legal duty to intervene. But on her own, Absent Pampanella's use of force being unlawful, there's likely no duty to intervene on the part of Price. So she'd be liable for nothing. As a result of the unreasonable and unjustifiable excessive force used by Pampanella and failure to intervene by Officer Price, Olivia Schwab suffered fatal injuries, resulting in her death. Well, obviously. Plaintiff count 2, that's just an Illinois wrongful death claim, basically making the same arguments. There's the children. And then an Illinois survival claim. This is another state level claim that's going to be argued out here in federal court, I suppose. I won't go into that. And just making sure here that that the city's also on the hook. So this is the state claim of indemnification. If we win this suit, we don't just want to win it against the officers because they have no money. We want to make sure the city is on the hook here too, because they're the ones with the deep pockets. And then they just make their claims for, we asked the court to find in favor of the plaintiffs to award unstated damages. Those will be figured out later, and punitive damages, and blah, blah, blah. So that's the money, and they want this done in front of a jury. And that's the claim.